Sati Rituals. This one didn't fully disappear until 1987, even though the British outlawed it. It's pre-colonial India, and you are a woman whose husband has recently died. Now, under our modern-day society rules, you'd receive sentiments and apologies from your friends and loved ones. But we are in 16th century India. As his widow, you would be expected or pressured by society and her in-laws to prove her dedication and pureness as a wife by climbing onto the literal burning pyre after his body was placed on it and burning alongside him. Sometimes things like clarified butter were poured over the widow to ensure she burned more easily. The reasonings behind this ritual varied, but common beliefs were that it released the widow from the cycle of rebirth and ensured her husband's spirit found peace in the afterlife. You are more often than not expected to do it out of your pure love for your husband, but if you didn't feel too strongly about him, say because he was a raging alcoholic, some Brahms, priests, would force you down and tie you to the pyre, till death do us part. Canaanite child sacrifice. The practice probably started off something like this. Baal, chief god, this extremely minor inconvenience that I could probably solve if I worked hard enough is troubling me. What should I do? Sacrifice your firstborn son on the full moon and I will solve your issue in about a week. At the time, Canaanites were a group of civilizations that lived in the region of modern-day Lebanon, Syria, Israel, and Palestine. So, during times of severe crisis like drought, famine, or war, the Canaanites would take their young kids, even infants, and burn them alive as offerings to gods like Baal or Moloch. The idea behind it was that by sacrificing something so precious, they could appease these powerful gods and turn things around. They could have tried irrigation, planting drought-resistant crops, or even just trading, but it seemed that sacrificing the literal product of one's pants was a simpler option than critical thinking, with some archaeologists finding disturbing writing like this: "To our Lord Baal, the child is a burnt offering, a son is given." Estimates put the death toll of these sacrifices at about 90,000 children. Mayan bloodletting rituals. With the Mayans, their relationship with their gods meant that for you to have a conversation with them, they needed at least a cup of blood to take you seriously. Think of their lives as sort of a pay-to-win game. Crops failing? That's probably like 2 liters of blood. A child suffering from the most horrendous and agonizing bout of illness that no doctor could treat? Sacrifice about 5 cups of your blood, and this random sky god will see what they can do. The Maya would use stingray spines, obsidian blades, or even rope to pierce their tongue, ears, or genitals, because all blood is good blood. They'd let the blood drip onto a piece of bark paper or into a bowl and then burn it as an offering to the gods. The idea was that they were opening up a communication channel with the supernatural realm by spilling their sacred blood. Aztec ritual sacrifice. Now, if you were a Spanish soldier who had spent some time under Hernan Cortez, you'd have seen everything by the 16th century. Cities made of gold, 100-foot pyramids made by hand, and the human sacrifice of thousands of prisoners. This is end-of-the-world stuff to any modern man, but it was an average Tuesday for them, and none took the role of human sacrifice as seriously as the Aztecs. During major festivals or after major conquests, the Aztecs would round up prisoners of war or purchase slaves. They'd march them up the steps of their grand pyramids, lay them out on a stone slab, and a priest would use an obsidian blade to cut open their chest and rip out their still beating heart. Horrifying to any new explorer, but the Aztecs saw it as an honor to be sacrificed this way. The idea was that the gods had to be constantly nourished with human blood and hearts to keep the sun rising and the world turning. So, to them, if they didn't sacrifice your Uncle Hernandez to a random sky god, the world would literally end the next day. Now, the number of sacrifices varies, but some sources claim that once these festivals started, over 10,000 people would be killed. Cannibalism in West Africa. If you ever felt that your third cup of coffee for the day just couldn't cut it, then perhaps what you're missing out on is cannibalism. You see, in West Africa, groups like the Kru people in what's now Liberia and Ivory Coast had this ritual society called, well, to the best of my research, I couldn't figure out how to pronounce that, and I don't want to offend anyone, so there it is. After a family member died, they would actually consume parts of the body. By eating the body, you now gained their power and strength. So if you ever had a rival that you were competing with, say an unfortunate accident, like you accidentally shooting him with a stray arrow and ate his heart, you'd become as brave as him. If you ate his legs, you'd become as quick as him. You get the idea. They would dry the body over a fire and consume it as a powder or ash mixture. To them, this was a sacred way to honor the deceased spirit and keep their essence in the community. The Edo people in Nigeria had a similar vibe going on. Eating deceased relatives was seen as a deeply reverent funerary practice that allowed the living to absorb the strength, wisdom, and spiritual guidance from their respected ancestors. Norse ritual sacrifice. Norse ritual sacrifices are what you'd get if you mixed angry 6-foot soldiers with the religion that told them that the more they killed, the better the chances are that they make it to Valhalla. Now, say you went to war against the Vikings and cursed one of their gods in the heat of battle. Thor is a fat you say. Unfortunately for you, you get captured by the now angry Viking, and it's just that time of year when sacrifices get them extra points. You'd get the Viking 3-for-1 special, the Blood Eagle. The condemned person, in this case you, was held face down. The executioner would then use a sharp instrument to cut along your back in the shape of an eagle's outspread wings. Your ribs would be ripped away from your spine, with the lungs pulled outward through the gaping wounds to copy the eagle's wings extended. Essentially, your ribcage was turned inside out while they were still alive and conscious. The reasoning behind this practice seemed to be an unholy symbolic act of releasing the victim's soul by having it metaphorically exit the body like a bird taking flight. Celtic ritual sacrifice. So, according to some ancient Roman accounts, the Celts living in regions like Britain and Gaul would construct huge wicker sculptures shaped like humanoid figures, sometimes standing several stories tall but hollow inside. These wicker men were essentially giant sacrifice cages woven from tree branches and twigs. During certain pagan festivals and rituals, the Celtic priests, known as druids, would stuff the hollow wicker men full of living men, often criminals or prisoners of war. Once packed inside, the wicker construct would then be set on fire, roasting and suffocating the souls trapped within as a burnt offering to the Celtic gods. The idea was that sacrificing humans in this brutal way, trapped inside symbolic wicker giants, would allow the druids to give a sacred gift to their gods while also instilling maximum fear and subjugation among the conquered peoples. Roman ritual sacrifice. Now, if you lived in the Roman Empire at the time, there were people known as the Vestal Virgins, chosen from noble Roman families who served a 30-year term of no sex dedicated to the goddess Vesta. This would be a great honor for them, but for you, it's basically your day-to-day life. Now, if one of these virgins did something most of you can't even do, have sex, they know this entitled them to being sacrificed. The now non-virgin Vestal would be stripped naked and carried on a coffin to a small underground chamber known as the Evil Fields. This room would contain a small bed, a lamp, and basic rations like bread, water, milk, and oil. Then they would literally seal the entrance, entombing the young woman alive in this tiny chamber to meet a slow, agonizing death from starvation and dehydration. The reasoning behind it was that the Vestals, by breaking their vow of virginity, had essentially committed an act so horrible that it would bring doom to Rome. Similar to the horrible, crushing feeling you get after sleeping with a prostitute behind your wife's back, the Vestal Virgin had cheated on Rome with another lesser man. Greek animal sacrifice. Now, if there's one thing that we have similar to the Greeks, it's how some people will always hate the ugliest or the handicapped in society. But unlike us, where it just stops with a few odd stares and bullying, the Greeks would go to the point of exhaling or just straight up killing ugly people, as they believed them to be the sources of the problems they had. During times of drought, plague, or extraordinary crisis, the Greeks would nominate an ugliest or least pleasing to look at person from the community, often a beggar or criminal. This person would then be dressed up, put up with figs, and paraded around the city while being beaten with fig branches and pelted with food as the people heaped abuses and curses upon them. Essentially, they became a vessel to absorb and symbolically embody all the pollution, sins, and misfortunes plaguing the population. After everyone was done beating him, the Pharmakos would be expelled from the city borders or even put to death by stoning, burning, or beating. The idea was that by eradicating this scapegoat, they were purging and purifying the community of any concentrated evil, disease, or ill fortune. Egyptian human sacrifice. It's probably the best example of how you should avoid working too hard at your 9 to 5 or you'll just be given more work. So, for the Egyptians, the idea was that when a powerful pharaoh pharaoh died, they would need servants, treasures, and supplies to accompany them into the afterlife to maintain their divine status and luxuries. After a pharaoh's extremely long mummification process, workers would start preparing their tomb, building secret chambers and stocking it with foods, jewels, and furniture. But perhaps the most disturbing were the living people chosen to be buried with their ruler. Servants, attendants, and even relatives who were either just strangled or given straight cyanide to die and placed strategically throughout the tomb's underground chambers. The idea was that these people's preserved bodies would symbolically reanimate in the afterlife to attend to all the pharaoh's needs, just like they did in life. So, after a lifetime of work, they get another endless lifetime of work, just like your job. Inca ritual sacrifice. The ritual sacrifice of children and youths as capacochas by the Incas was like selecting bright-eyed kindergartners and high school students, fattening them up, dressing them in the best clothes, and then slaughtering them on the altar whenever you wanted your favorite presidential candidate to win. It was a common thing among many of the pre-Columbian cultures in the Americas back then. For the Incas, they would often sacrifice children and young adults who were considered sacred offerings to their gods. They called these sacrificial victims capacochas. From the information given by archaeologists, the capacochas were usually well-nourished kids and youths who were carefully prepared for the ceremonies. During major events like crowning a new emperor, natural disasters, or big festivals like their sun celebration, Inti Raymi, they'd perform these sacrificial rituals. The sacrifices were pretty insane even by today's standards, strangling or cutting out the heart while the victim was still alive. But to the Incas, it was a spiritual act they believed was vital for ensuring the empire's prosperity and good harvests. The same way we spray our fields was the same way we needed children to die in order for them to survive the next harvest. Combined with the fact that they simply weren't ready to risk the chance that children didn't actually need to die, then you have a ritual that was going on for hundreds of years. Of course, you have to remember that ritual sacrifice was just a part of their culture and beliefs back then. As shocking as it might seem now, they truly saw it as necessary to maintain balance with their gods who controlled all their lives.